They called her insane. A British nurse in war-torn Japan, 1946, doing the unthinkable, inviting the enemy into her tent for tea. Her commanding officers warned her she'd start a riot. The Japanese women she approached trembled in terror, believing she'd poison them. But what happened next in that makeshift tent would shatter every wall that war had built between two nations, and the ripples of her crazy act would echo through generations. This is the story of how one woman's quiet rebellion against hate became the most powerful weapon of all. Before we dive into this extraordinary tale, drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching from. I want to know how far this message of hope travels today. The year is 1946. Japan lies in ruins. Hiroshima and Nagasaki are still smoldering shadows of cities. Tokyo is a landscape of ash and rubble where children pick through debris searching for scraps of food. The war is over, but the wounds, psychological, cultural, spiritual, are raw and gaping. The British Commonwealth Occupation Force has arrived in the Southern Islands, part of the Allied presence meant to rebuild what was destroyed. But you cannot rebuild trust with tanks. You cannot reconstruct humanity with military orders. And in the devastated port city of Kure, where Imperial Japanese Navy ships once ruled the Pacific, the divide between occupier and occupied is an ocean wider than the one that separates their homelands. British soldiers patrol streets lined with hollow-eyed civilians who bow their heads and avert their gaze. Japanese women clutch their children and disappear into alleyways when military trucks rumble past. The propaganda of war has taught both sides to see monsters in each other's faces. Fear is the only language they share. Into this fractured world steps a woman whose name history nearly forgot, but whose actions would prove that courage sometimes looks like an invitation to tea. Her name was Nurse Margaret Evans, though the soldiers simply called her Matron Evans, with a mix of respect and bewilderment. At 43, she was older than most of the medical staff, a veteran of field hospitals in North Africa and Burma who had seen enough of war's brutality to last several lifetimes. Her face was kind but weathered, lines etched deep around eyes that had witnessed too much suffering. She had lost her own son, a pilot, over the English Channel in 1944, a grief she carried in silence, folded away like a letter she couldn't bear to reread. But that loss had not hardened her. If anything, it had cracked her open to a dangerous kind of empathy, the kind that makes you see the humanity in everyone, even those you're supposed to keep at arm's length. Margaret had been a schoolteacher before the war, teaching English literature in a small Cotswold village. She understood the power of stories, of shared rituals, of the small ceremonies that bind people together. And she had studied Japanese culture with an intensity that puzzled her colleagues, reading what little translated material she could find, learning basic phrases from a tattered dictionary, practicing calligraphy in her spare moments. "Why bother?" the other nurses asked. "They lost. We won. That's all that matters." But Margaret knew that war's endings are never that simple. Her first disruption of protocol came on a gray morning in late March, when she did something that sent shockwaves through the military command. A group of Japanese women had been gathered near the base perimeter. Displaced persons waiting for ration distributions, mothers with gaunt faces, and children whose bellies protruded with malnutrition. The official policy was clear: minimal interaction, professional distance, no fraternization. But Margaret walked through the checkpoint, past the confused guards, directly to the women and bowed. Not a casual nod, but a deep formal bow of respect. The kind reserved for equals, for human beings worthy of dignity. The women froze. Several backed away in fear. The soldiers looked at each other, unsure whether to intervene. And then Margaret did something even more shocking. She knelt in the mud beside a young mother whose infant was crying. And in broken but careful Japanese she said, "Please, I am sorry for your pain. May I help?" The young mother stared at her, tears streaming, unable to speak. That moment, that simple act of kneeling in mud before those she was supposed to keep beneath her, became the first crack in an impenetrable wall. But Margaret's defiance didn't stop there. She began requesting supplies not for the British medical ward, but to set up a civilian clinic. She demanded translators. She spent her off hours visiting devastated neighborhoods, bringing medicine and bandages, learning the names of children, listening to stories of loss that mirrored her own. And the more she connected with the Japanese civilians, the more resistance she faced from multiple fronts. The antagonists in this story weren't cartoon villains. They were products of their time, trapped in fear and prejudice that war had legitimized. There was Colonel Harrington, the base commander, a rigid career military man who saw Margaret's compassion as a dangerous breach of discipline. "You're making us look weak, Evans," he barked during one heated confrontation. "These people need to understand who won this war. Kindness is interpreted as guilt or weakness. You're undermining everything we're trying to establish here." His concern wasn't entirely without merit. He feared that fraternization would lead to exploitation, black market dealings, or worse. But his solution was isolation, control, the maintenance of superior and subordinate roles. He represented the institutional resistance to healing, the bureaucratic machinery that perpetuates division in the name of order. Then there were her fellow nurses and medical staff. Women like Nurse Patricia Aldridge, who had lost a brother at the hands of Japanese forces. In Singapore, Patricia's grief had crystallized into cold hatred. She couldn't understand how Margaret could betray the memory of Allied soldiers by showing kindness to the enemy. "My brother was tortured," Patricia said, her voice shaking with rage and tears. "He was 22 years old. They starved him, beat him, worked him to death building that bloody railway. And you want us to have tea parties with them? You want us to pretend it didn't happen?" Patricia represented the righteous anger of the wounded, the voice that says some divides are too deep to bridge, some hurts too profound to forgive. Her pain was real, her anger justified, and she wasn't alone. Many of the staff shared her sentiment, viewing Margaret's efforts as naive at best, traitorous at worst. And then there were the Japanese women themselves, a different kind of antagonist, not through malice but through terror. Years of propaganda had taught them that Western soldiers were demons who would rape and murder, without mercy. They had been told that occupation meant enslavement, that foreign devils would desecrate their families and destroy their culture. Even after months of relatively peaceful occupation, trust was non-existent. Women like Tanaka Yuki, a 38-year-old widow whose husband had died in the Navy and whose 2 teenage sons had perished in the firebombing of Kure, would cross the street to avoid British soldiers. Her eyes held a bottomless grief and a reflexive fear. When Margaret tried to approach her at the ration line, Yuki's hands trembled so violently she dropped her bowl. "Please, no," she whispered in Japanese, tears streaming down her face. "Please don't hurt me." She represented the collective trauma of an entire population, the internalized belief that they deserved punishment, that mercy was impossible. Margaret knew she needed to do something radical, something that transcended words and official programs. She needed a gesture that spoke the language of culture itself, that honored Japanese tradition while extending British fellowship. And so she conceived what everyone, from the colonel to her fellow nurses to the traumatized civilians, considered absolute madness. She would host a traditional Japanese tea ceremony, inviting local women into the British medical compound to share tea as equals, as fellow human beings, as mothers and daughters and sisters bound by the universal experience of loss and the universal hope for peace. When she announced this plan, the reaction was explosive. Colonel Harrington slammed his fist on the desk. "Absolutely not. I forbid it. You'll create a security risk, a diplomatic incident, and make us look like fools. Tea ceremony? This is an occupied territory, not a garden party." Patricia confronted her in the nurses' quarters, voice breaking. "How dare you? How dare you honor their traditions, their culture, after what they did? You're spitting on Allied graves." The other staff whispered behind her back. Poor Margaret, lost her son and lost her mind with him. Tragic, really. Even the translators tried to dissuade her, warning that the Japanese women would never come, that fear was too deeply rooted, that she'd humiliate herself and accomplish nothing. The obstacles seemed insurmountable. Margaret had no authority to requisition supplies for such an event. She had no support from command. She had no guarantee anyone would even show up. But Margaret Evans was not a woman who surrendered to impossibility. In quiet defiance, she began preparing. She traded her personal tobacco rations for tatami mats from a local craftsman. She learned the intricate steps of the tea ceremony from an elderly Japanese gentleman who swept the compound, a man who had once been a tea master in Kyoto and now lived in a refugee shelter. She practiced for hours, learning to whisk matcha, understanding the significance of each movement, each gesture of respect. She wrote personal invitations in careful Japanese characters and delivered them herself to the women she'd been building tentative connections with over months of patient outreach. "Please," she wrote, "come share tea with me. Not as victor and vanquished, but as women who have known loss and seek peace. I honor your culture. I honor your pain. I offer only kindness." The responses were silence, fear, hesitation. Days passed. Then, the morning before her planned ceremony, Something shifted. Tanaka Yuki, the widow who had trembled at Margaret's approach, appeared at the compound gate holding Margaret's invitation. Through the translator, she said quietly, "I had a dream. My husband came to me and said, 'Fear is the enemy now. The war you must fight now is against fear itself. I do not know if I can trust you, but I am tired of being afraid. I will come.'" That single act of courage rippled through the community. Word spread among the women, "If Yuki-san, who lost everything, is willing to try, perhaps we should too." On the designated afternoon, as the spring sun filtered through cherry blossoms just beginning to bloom among the ruins, something impossible happened. 7 Japanese women, dressed in their best remaining kimonos, carefully repaired and cleaned, appeared at the compound gate. 7 women who had been taught to fear, to hate, to hide, walked voluntarily into what they'd been told was enemy territory. The British soldiers on duty didn't know what to do. Neither did Colonel Harrington, who watched from his office window with a mix of fury and unwilling fascination. Patricia and several other nurses stood at a distance, arms crossed, faces hard with judgment. Margaret greeted each woman with a deep bow, using their names, welcoming them in Japanese. She had transformed a corner of the medical tent into a space of tranquility. Tatami mats laid carefully, a simple flower arrangement, borrowed tea implements arranged with precise attention to tradition. The women entered slowly, uncertainty in every step. The tension was suffocating. No one spoke. The gulf between them felt cosmic. These women had lost husbands, sons, fathers, homes to the Allied bombing campaigns Margaret's countrymen had executed. Margaret herself wore the uniform of the occupying force. How could tea bridge such chasms? The silence stretched, painful and fragile. You could feel it might shatter into chaos at any moment. That the slightest wrong word or gesture could send everyone fleeing, confirming that reconciliation was impossible. Then Margaret began the ceremony. Her hands moved through the ritual with studied care, whisking the tea, turning the bowl, offering it with both hands in the traditional manner. And as she performed each movement, she began to speak, not in proclamations or justifications, but in story. In quiet, halting Japanese supplemented by the translator, she told them about her village in England, about teaching children to read poetry, about her son, James, who loved aircraft and dreamed of becoming an engineer, about the telegram that arrived one gray morning in 1944, and how the world had stopped making sense, about loss that still woke her at night, gasping, reaching for a child who would never come home. Her voice cracked. Tears fell silent down her face as she served the first cup to Yuki. "I cannot undo what war has done," Margaret said, meeting Yuki's eyes. "I cannot bring back your husband or my son, but I can choose what happens now. I can choose to see you, to honor your pain, to refuse to let hatred win." The room was utterly still. And then Yuki, hands shaking, accepted the tea bowl. She brought it to her lips and drank. Tears streamed down her face. And in broken, emotion-choked words, she began to tell her own story. About her husband who loved poetry. About her sons who were kind boys with futures stretching before them. About the night the bombers came and how she'd searched through ashes looking for anything, any small thing to bury. The other women listened, their own tears falling. One by one they began to share. Stories of loss, of fear, of children going hungry, of trying to find meaning in devastation. And Margaret listened with her whole being, not defending, not justifying, just witnessing their pain with complete open-hearted presence. Then something unexpected happened. Old Mr. Watanabe, the tea master who'd been sweeping nearby, approached hesitantly. He looked at Margaret and spoke in Japanese. The translator's voice wavered with emotion. He says you have honored the tea ceremony with profound respect. He says your spirit understands harmony. He asks permission to join. Margaret immediately stood and bowed deeply, welcoming him. And Watanabe-san, with hands that remembered decades of practiced movement, took over the ceremony. He prepared tea with such grace, such beauty, that everyone watched in reverent silence. When he served Margaret, he said something that made the translator pause, trying to find the right words. True tea ceremony is not about perfection of form. It is about ichigo-ichi, one time, one meeting. This moment will never come again. Each gathering is precious and irreplaceable. You understand this. You honor not just our custom, but the truth beneath it, that each human meeting is sacred and unique. The women began talking amongst themselves, barriers crumbling. One woman brought out photos of her children from a hidden pocket. Another sang a quiet lullaby her mother had taught her. Margaret shared biscuits she'd been saving from her personal rations. English tea biscuits that tasted of home, of normalcy, of a world before war. And as they ate together, drank together, wept together, something profound was happening. The British soldiers watching from a distance saw it. Patricia, standing with arms crossed, felt something crack in her chest. Even Colonel Harrington, observing from his window, felt his certainty wavering. But the most shocking revelation was still to come. As the ceremony concluded and the women were preparing to leave, Yuki turned to Margaret and said through the translator, "Please, we wish to return. But next time, may we bring something? May we teach you our songs? Our children, they need to see that the world is not only hate. They need to see this. What you have done, it is medicine for more than body. It is medicine for the soul." Margaret, overwhelmed, simply nodded, unable to speak. Through tears. But then Patricia suddenly stepped forward, her face a conflict of emotions. "Wait," she said, her voice harsh with suppressed feeling. Everyone turned. Patricia looked at Yuki, at the women, at Margaret. Her hands were clenched at her sides. "My brother," she began, then stopped. Tried again. "My brother wrote letters from the camp. Before he died. The last one he sent said he'd met a Japanese civilian who'd shared rice with him, against orders, risking punishment. He wrote that he understood then that people were people, that the enemy wasn't a race or a nation but war itself." Her voice broke. "I was so angry. I thought he'd gone mad from suffering. I couldn't accept it. But standing here, watching this," she looked at Margaret, "you're not betraying him. You're honoring what he tried to tell me." The silence that followed was different than before. Not empty, but full. Pregnant with possibility. Patricia approached Yuki hesitantly and, in the universal gesture of grief, placed a hand over her own heart, then extended it toward Yuki. Yuki understood immediately and did the same. No words, just acknowledgement, just witness, just two women who had lost so much, recognizing each other's humanity. Word of the tea gathering spread like wildfire through both the military base and the local community. What Margaret had started couldn't be stopped. More women began coming. Then elderly men. Then, cautiously, children. The weekly tea ceremonies became a bridge between worlds. British personnel began attending, learning Japanese phrases, hearing stories, sharing their own. The ceremonies expanded to include music. A British nurse played violin while a Japanese woman sang traditional songs, their melodies intertwining. Children from both sides played together, inventing games that needed no common language. The compound that had been a symbol of occupation became a space of healing. Colonel Harrington called Margaret to his office 3 months after that first ceremony. She expected reprimand, possibly transfer. Instead, he said gruffly, uncomfortably, "I was wrong. HQ wants a full report on your methods. They're seeing measurable drops in tension, in incidents, in hostility. Whatever you're doing, they want it replicated across other occupation zones." He paused, looking out the window at a scene of British soldiers and Japanese civilians building a playground together. "I didn't think it was possible. I didn't think people could heal this fast. But you've proven that sometimes the most strategic thing a soldier can do is put down the weapon and pick up a teacup." Margaret smiled gently. "Not just a teacup, Colonel. A willingness to be vulnerable. To admit we've all been hurt. To choose connection over fear." The tea ceremonies continued for years, evolving into cultural exchange programs that would shape post-war reconciliation efforts throughout Japan. Margaret's crazy gesture became a model, studied by peacekeeping forces worldwide. But perhaps the most powerful outcome was the transformation it created in individual hearts. Patricia eventually wrote to Yuki, asking to learn more about Japanese culture, trying to understand the world her brother had glimpsed before he died. Yuki in turn began teaching English to local children, seeing education as a bridge to peace. The children who played together in those early gatherings grew up with different assumptions about the other, carrying forward a legacy of connection rather than hatred. Years later, when Margaret was preparing to return to England, Yuki came to say goodbye. Through careful English she'd been practicing, she said, "You did not give us tea. You gave us our humanity back. You saw us when we were invisible. You honored us when we believed we deserved only punishment. This is the greatest gift. Not victory, not charity, but recognition, but seeing." She placed in Margaret's hands a carefully wrapped package. Inside was a tea bowl, simple but exquisite, marked with cherry blossoms. From Watanabe-san, he made it for you. He says you are a true tea master, not because of technique, but because you understand the heart of it. That sharing tea is sharing ourselves, our vulnerability, our common humanity. What Margaret had done wasn't magic. It wasn't even particularly complicated. She had simply refused to accept that fear and hatred were permanent conditions. She had chosen to honor the IE, traditions and dignity of people she'd been taught to see as enemies. She had been willing to be vulnerable first, to show her own pain, to break protocol in service of something higher than military order. The recognition that healing requires risk, that peace demands courage, and that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is invite someone you're supposed to fear to sit down and share tea. Her story reminds us that transformation doesn't always come through grand gestures or official programs. Sometimes it comes through one person deciding that humanity matters more than history, that connection matters more than conquest, that the walls we build between each other are never as strong as the bridges we're capable of creating. In a world still fractured by conflict, still divided by us versus them thinking, still haunted by violence and fear, Margaret's story is more than historical curiosity. It's a blueprint. It's a challenge. It's an invitation. What small gesture of radical kindness might crack open a seemingly impossible divide in your own life? Who have you been taught to fear that you might instead choose to see? What ritual of connection might bridge the gaps that feel unbridgeable? Margaret didn't wait for governments or institutions to create peace. She didn't wait for permission or perfect conditions. She simply extended an invitation to share tea, and in that small act, changed the world for dozens, then hundreds, then thousands of people. The message is clear and enduring. Compassion is not weakness. It is the fiercest form of courage. Vulnerability is not defeat. It is the gateway to true connection. Forgiveness is not forgetting. It is refusing to let the past dictate the future. Healing is not easy, but it is always possible when even one person is willing to take the first step, to extend the first hand, to pour the first cup of tea. Margaret Evans understood what many still struggle to grasp, that the antidote to fear is not force, but fellowship. That the cure for hatred is not victory, but the voluntary choice to see the human being on the other side of the divide. She knew that every person carrying hatred is also carrying pain, and that addressing the pain is the only way to dissolve the hate. If this story moved you, if it challenged you, if it sparked something in your heart about the world you want to create, please do me a favor, hit that like button and let this message spread. Drop a comment sharing your own story of bridging divides or extending unexpected kindness. Your words might inspire someone else to take that courageous first step. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this message today. And subscribe to this channel because these are the stories that matter. Stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary things through simple acts of profound courage. Stories that remind us who we're capable of being. Stories that prove love is always stronger than fear, always more powerful than hate, and always worth the risk. Together, let's be people who choose tea over terror, connection over conflict, and humanity over history. The world Margaret helped create begins with each of us, one small gesture of radical kindness at a time.